Do you ever enter your day buried below a mudslide of information, but with this bewildering sense that you may not understand anymore about what's going on in the world? This sense, this tension between information and bewilderment is typical of transition times. We live in transition times and they are bewildering. And the reason for this is that the old is dying and the new is struggling to be born. But in this interregnum, what's really going on is that the old story has collapsed and we haven't found a new story that is generally accepted, which is necessary for the new to be brought into being. So the question then that raises is, what is this new story and how should we start putting it together? There is no doubt we are living in transition times. The scientific consensus is absolutely clear. If we continue to run the global economy as we currently do, we're going to blow the fuses of the planet. We're going to destroy the conditions of existence for human civilization as we know it. And yet, in that same moment, in 2015, the world reached for hope and adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are the first time that we as a community of nations have committed ourselves to eradicating poverty without destroying the planet. That is a significant commitment. If you read the preamble to the SDGs, you will see that there is a remarkable statement about a commitment to living in a transformed world. Governments around the world, businesses, increasing numbers of citizens accept the scientific consensus. There's an acceptance that things need to change, and yet we go about our lives on an everyday basis as if nothing is changing. We make economic policy decisions based on economic models to allocate capital and resources as if the scientific consensus doesn't exist. And that really is the paradoxical challenge that we face if we really are interested in a green transition, or what I prefer to call a just transition. There are three fundamental questions that we need to ask. The first is, what is the scientific consensus that everybody talks about? Secondly, what is the economic consensus that we assume? Thirdly, what are the dynamics of transition that are reshaping the world above our heads, below our feet, behind our backs, and not often very clearly in front of us? And if we can answer those three questions, maybe that would provide the basis for answering a really important, but a question that is hardly ever asked, which is, how do we reconcile our economics and our science? We simply cannot deny the fact that our biggest economic challenges in the world, inequality, unemployment, poverty, and the mass suffering that comes from increasingly unhealthy environments, and so on and so forth. We cannot address these challenges while ignoring the natural challenges, the rise in natural disasters, the declining quality of our soils that is that's resulting in declining growth year on year of food production, the collapse of our fisheries, and even the collapse of very sensitive ecosystems like pollination because of what's happening to the bees. We can't ignore this reality anymore, but we can ask, well, how come over the last 25, 30 years, as we have breached planetary boundaries, have we also been able to sustain actually quite high levels of economic growth? How can you grow an economy while you're destroying what it depends on? How do we make sense of that? The only way you can answer that question is to recognize that over the last 20, 30 years, we have transitioned from an economies based on savings and production to economies based on debt and consumption. What we are actually doing in reality is borrowing the future from our children without any idea how we pay it back. Now, economic theory is a mystery for most people. But what you need to know is that economic theory, in general, does not take into account energy and materials. For economic theory, the objective is growth, and there's assumptions about unlimited growth, despite the scientific consensus that we live on a finite planet which can't continue to generate the resources that we require. People were hopeful that when the financial bubble burst in 2007, 2008, leading into 2009, which was the first and only year since the Second World War that the global economy shrank, there was a sense that, okay, this economic theory, known as neoliberalism or neoclassical economics, would collapse and would get replaced. That didn't happen. Instead, we shifted into belt tightening, into austerity, and the shrinking of the middle class, which has unleashed rather deadly passions. Instead of identifying the real problem, people who start to get anxious about the fact that the next generation might not be as well off as the current generation start to lash out at easy targets like people of color, like greenies, like women, while the richest 1% do better and better. 27 of the richest people in the world have an accumulated wealth equal to the bottom 50% of the whole global population. This is totally and utterly unsustainable. So come back to my questions. The first question, the scientific consensus. What is it? The scientific consensus really rests on three key pillars. The first is about climate change. Climate change is a threat to human existence as we know it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its report last year, which essentially gave us 12 years to turn the ship of the global economy around, to decarbonize it, which is simply another way of saying transferring the energy base from a dependence on fossil fuels to a dependence on renewables. The second pillar is biodiversity loss and the destruction of ecosystem services. Scientists talk about the sixth great extinction. The extinction of an extinction rate which is resulting in the destruction of a large number of ecosystem services that the web of life depends on, including us. And thirdly, which is a lot of the work that I've been doing, we are dependent on the extraction of a package of resources from the crust of the earth. These are fossil fuels, biomass, metals, and construction minerals, basically building sand and cement. And we extract about 70 billion tons of this stuff. We actually extract double that, but we use 70 billion, we throw away the rest. That's the environmental crisis. If the economy continues business as usual, we'll need 140 billion tons of stuff. We'll have to use 140 billion tons of stuff by 2050. And there's no scientific evidence, none. Let me repeat, no scientific evidence, none, that the resources are available to meet that demand. We're facing that harsh, brutal reality. So those are the three pillars of the scientific consensus. The economic consensus is based also on three pillars. The first one is the state is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution. And so the best thing you can do is shrink it, withdraw it, and let the private sector do the job for profit. Despite the fact that there's a lot of evidence that that is not always true. It's true in some cases, it's not true in other cases, but still we retain the belief that the state is part of the problem. Secondly, that debt is a fundamental evil. That we should not increase debt, the debt to GDP ratio to more than 60%, despite economic history, which tells us no developed country has achieved its developmental goals without going way above those debt levels. And yet, we say we can't do more than that. The third is that subsidies are bad. You get what you pay for, and if you're too poor to pay for it, that's your fault. Get your act together. So based on these much more sophisticated versions of those three key principles is our economic theory, our economic model, and that is in turn the basis of our economic policy decisions. Now, these two don't add up. These two are not based on the same basic laws and principles. The third question is the transition dynamics, and in my view there are 5 key transition dynamics. The first is that the global renewable energy revolution is already underway. The total expenditure on renewables now is roughly $300 billion, and that is double the total expenditure on fossil fuels and nuclear combined. The price of renewables has come down by about 90% over the last 10 years, and 157 countries have got renewables targets, and 57 of those countries are committed to 100% renewables. While at the same time, coal has become unprofitable. Most of the biggest financial institutions in the world over the last 12 to 18 months have declared that they are withdrawing investments in coal, and even some of the big coal majors have made commitments to withdraw from coal. So as coal goes into decline, renewables are going, we're seeing a renewable energy revolution. In South Africa, we have to close nearly all our coal mines by 2041. We have a 20-year window to make this transition. The second is that we're going through a techno-industrial transition. Modern societies are based on clusters of communication, energy, and mobility technologies. Whenever these change, everything else changes. Think of the printing press and the steam engine. We are seeing, and there's been 5 of these major transitions since over the last 250 years. We are going through the 6th transition as a result of massive new investments in new forms of energy, which I've just described. The Internet of Things, or Web 3.0, or if you want to use that awful term, 4th Industrial Revolution, and the third is new mobility systems not based on the combustion engine. In combination, a new industrial base is beginning to emerge. The third is urbanization. For the first time in human history, most of us live in cities. And the biggest and fastest expansion of our cities is in the global south, from roughly 400 million to 4 billion people over a period of 80 years. In Africa, there are 400 million people living in cities. Another 800 million are projected to be living in cities within the next 20, 30 years. What's really interesting, though, is that at city level, many of these challenges are faced on a daily basis. And across the world, there are literally tens of thousands of initiatives by all sorts of fascinating coalitions that are leading incredible urban transitions to be post-carbon, to be totally on renewables, to green, to create healthy environments, basically a movement for livable cities. It's big, it's powerful, it's impactful. And then finally, Africa. We all know Africa is rising. We all know that growth rates in many African countries are between 4, 5, and 9%. But what we don't realize is that the total installed electrical generation capacity on the African continent is equal to what exists in France. With 80 million people, we've got over 1 billion. If Africa energizes using fossil fuels, none of the climate targets agreed in Paris in 2015 will be achieved. And that's an absolute fact. So the whole world has an interest in making sure that Africa energizes using renewables. These are the 5 key transition dynamics. So let's come back to economic theory. According to the underlying assumption for neoliberal, neoclassical economics is that economies tend towards equilibrium. Left to their own devices, they'll tend towards equilibrium. It follows that state intervention is irrational. It will be dysfunctional. Now, in the kind of world that I have just described, does it really make sense to assume that economies tend towards disequilibrium when we know that the rest of reality does not? And do we really seriously think that left to the market, that this is going to be, that we're going to have the organizing principles to address our challenges? No. There is an alternative body of economic theory called heterodox economics. And the underlying assumption of heterodox economics is that economies tend towards disequilibrium, which is very similar to the underlying principles in the natural world. The logical consequence of that assumption is that if economies tend towards disequilibrium, then state intervention does make sense. And it's in that context that I think we need to start thinking about how we develop new non-equilibrium economic models to underpin our economic policy making so that economic policy making can align with the challenges we face. I would say that there are 5 things that would need to change if we wanted to reconcile our economics and our science. Firstly, economics must incorporate an understanding of energy and materials in the way that I've articulated. Secondly, accept state intervention is necessary. Thirdly, that the decline of fossil fuels is pretty much inevitable. Fourthly, that information and communication technologies are redefining the way we communicate, learn, and act. And fifthly, we will have to take drastic measures to address the challenge of inequality. If you put all of this together, I think what people are calling for, what the youth marches are calling for, is a new story that makes it possible to think of the future as being about restoration, as being about abundance, about belonging. Above all, in times of transitions, what people crave most is a sense of belonging and a belief in the possibility of a future that is practically achievable. That is now possible. So let's look at the South African case briefly. We know all the problems in the South African context, very similar to other countries, inequalities, social conflict, governance challenges, but we also have incredible advantages. We have one of the fastest growing renewable energy sectors in the world. We have a surplus of cash, believe it or not. We have an IT infrastructure. We have a good banking system. We have national energy and transport grids, and we have an abundance of resources. The question is, will we correctly read the moment? Are we prepared to give up the hardest thing of all, which is our precious, precious ways of seeing the past, through lenses, through filters that no longer make sense, that don't interpret reality in the way that it should be understood? Will we see things differently? Will we accept that we need investment-led, inclusive growth with a focus on production, not consumption, in the IT sectors, in renewable energy, in mobility, in ecosystem restoration, in an inclusive way? All nations have to commit to the just transition. And I had a discussion with one of our cabinet ministers the day before yesterday, and he leaned back in his chair and he said, "So what is this just transition, Mark?" And I said, "It's simply this. It's decarbonization with equity. It's as simple as that." Can we reconcile? Can we really reconcile our vision of potentials with the understanding of the opportunities that really face us? Is it possible to reconcile our economics and our science in a way that makes it possible to build this new story? As long as there is a conflict between these two major bodies of knowledge, the new story is simply not going to emerge. Will we read the moment? Will we celebrate the potential or fear the unknown? Will we embrace the new story? Will we celebrate the possibility of a story of abundance, of restoration, of belonging? Because this is what the young people who are marching in the next few days are calling for. This is what they expect of the summit happening, called by the Secretary General of the United Nations on the 23rd of September, to all governments to come and bring what he called clear and ambitious programs for a new world. Are we prepared to embrace the just transition? I think we can, and it's practically viable. Thank you.